In this question, we are given an expression which is a product of two brackets. One of them contains an unknown and the other one is a standard bracket to the power of 5. And we are told that upon expanding both of these brackets together, the x squared term is going to have coefficient 0, and we have to find the unknown in one of our brackets. Okay, so this is a standard sort of question. Let's see how we could do this. So to be able to do this, we need to figure out what the x squared term coming out of the entire expansion here is going to be. Okay, so in other words, once we've expanded this thing and then we've multiplied it by this thing, whatever we get as a final expansion, we need to know what the x squared term in that expansion is going to be. And then we're going to set the coefficient of that term to 0. And hopefully that will give us an equation which we can solve to figure out the value of our unknown. So that's the strategy. Let's see what the details are. So it's sensible to start by expanding this power of 5. So by now we should be quite comfortable with this, and I'm just going to apply the binomial theorem. But actually, a clever thing to do would be not to expand everything, okay? Because we don't need all the terms. We only need the x squared term, okay? Which means I don't need to be expanding the cube terms and the power of 4 terms and so on. So I'm just going to restrict myself to the x to the 0 term, the x to the 1 term, and the x squared term. And we're going to do this using the standard approach, which is just write down the coefficients. So I'm only going to write them down for the first 3 terms, and then to write out a 3 everywhere, because that's my a in this case, and then to write out an x everywhere, because that's my b in this case, and obviously I have a plus, so that's sensible. And then finally, my power on the left-hand side is 5, which means I start with 5 on the 3 and keep reducing it by 1 as I go to the right. But then on the other term, I start with a 0 and keep increasing it by 1. Okay, so this is essentially our expansion, and we can tidy this up. We just tidy up this term here as 3 to the 5, because x to the 0 is going to give me 1. And then 5 times 3 to the 4 times by x, that's what I have. And then finally, the x squared term for this bracket is going to be 10 times 3 cubed times by x squared, which is what we have here. And we can work these numbers out using our calculator, and we get this expansion. Obviously, technically, the expansion continues, but as I've said, we don't need those terms, so there's no point working them out. Okay, so at this stage, we need to take this and multiply it by 2 minus px. So that's what we're going to do. But again, we could do it in a slightly silly way, which is to expand everything out here. And that's going to work, but that's going to be needless work and it's going to take time. Okay, so the sensible thing to do is to pick out the only things that are going to multiply to give you x squared. Okay, so think about what are the different ways of making x squared. So you can have an x squared term multiplied by x to the 0 term, right? So you add the indices, so 0 plus 2 is 2, so this would give you an x squared term. Okay, the other way of getting an x squared term is an x term multiplied by another x term. So that's going to give you an x squared term. There isn't a third way of getting an x squared term here. Okay, if there was an x squared in the first bracket, that would multiply by the constant term to give us an x squared term. But we don't have an x squared in the first bracket, so we don't have another way of getting an x squared term. So we've only got 2 ways. So rather than expanding this and getting 6 terms out, I'm only going to write 2 terms down. The first one is the red term, which is 2 times by 270 x squared, which is here. And then the second one is the green term, which is minus px times by 405x, which is minus p times 405x squared. Okay, so we have our x squared term, but we can actually simplify this by collecting the term. 2 times 270 is 540, and obviously minus p times by 405 is minus 405p. And they're both x squared terms, so I can factorize out the x squared to be able to get this. So in other words, we have our x squared term entirely, and this is our coefficient, 540 minus 405p. So we set this equal to 0. That's a linear equation which only has one unknown, p. We solve that, and the p works out to be 540 divided by 405, but you stick that in your calculator, and it simplifies to 4/3. So in other words, we've been able to answer this question. We've worked out our value of p. It is 4/3. I hope you found this useful. If you did find it useful, then do consider subscribing.